Tonight we have a presentation by Ann Ross in California, and she's going to talk about the secret life of postcard artist Phil May. By the way, just if you don't know, she has a Facebook group that about artist signed postcards, and she puts a lot of stuff up on there. I think probably a couple times a day. So it's a really good group. If you haven't seen it, you search for it. And what's it called?
Vintage artist signed postcards.
So, Ann, take it away.
All right, so today I'm going to introduce you all to a postcard artist named Phil May. He was born in 1864 in Leeds in Yorkshire, and he died in 1903 in London at the early age of 39. And basically, his life was a conundrum of opposites. He was known as the drinking man's cartoonist because his life and art revolved around alcohol. He survived poverty and homelessness to become the undisputed king of Britain's comic illustrators in the 1890s. Even though he never completed any formalized art training, drunk or sober, Phil was beloved by a wide circle of friends from all walks of life. During his short life, he illustrated 31 books, and his pen and ink sketches appeared in 33 different magazines. His postcards were published, and some were published posthumously by Raphael Tuck of London, Valentine's, Wrench, and Landecker and Brown. And I got interested in him initially because I have a background in the horse world, and he was a horse lover, and a lot of his artwork featured horses. And I started, researching his life and his postcards, and I realized that his postcards reflected his struggles with alcoholism and also a secret affair that he hid from the public by constructing a web of lies, basically. The truth about his life remained concealed for about 100 years because his biographers took the quotes that he put out in interviews and in newspapers and things like that. They took his word for gospel. And when I was a social worker, one of my placements was at an addictions treatment center. So I'm pretty familiar with alcoholism and how it affects people and their families. So I could see his alcohol progressing through biographical accounts of him and also in his postcards. So I can't claim to be the only person that knows the information that I'm going to share with you, but originally I thought I was doing original research into his secret life. And then I did find there was someone who works for, I think it's either the Leeds Library in Yorkshire or the museum in Leeds. And on their website is some of the information that I found. So the information that I'm going to be sharing with you today first appeared in my article. Actually, there's two of them. In Picture Postcard Collecting Magazine, which is a British magazine, which alas is no more. So Phil, he lived a fairly hard life in the beginning. Here's his childhood home in Wortley, which was a suburb of Leeds. He was the seventh of 8 children. Phil's brother Charles was also an artist, but not as talented as Phil was. And Phil loved drawing from an early age. From about the age of 5 and 6, he was doodling and drawing horses and military subjects. And unfortunately, this house where he grew up, this house is no more. It was demolished in the 1960s. And here you see Phil May's parents, his father, Philip William May, the senior on the left. This, I think, is a sketch by Phil's brother Charles, who was older. And then his mother over here on the right, Sarah Jane McCarthy. Phil's father was a failed businessman with a drinking problem. And I also discovered by poking around on ancestry.com that he had a criminal record. He was arrested and convicted for embezzling money from his employer, and he was sentenced to 2 years hard labor and, I'm sorry, 2 months hard labor and jail. Phil's mother, born in Ireland, she dreamed of becoming an actress, but her career never went anywhere because she suffered from stage fright. Now, the one thing that I want to point out is you want to remember how she's dressed. She has her hair straight and it's parted in the center, and she's wearing a small like bonnet with a feather. She looks like she's wearing like in mourning dress in black. And we'll talk about that more in a couple slides. This card was one that popped up that really spoke to me, that reminded me of the old phrase that you may have heard: art imitates life and life imitates art. And I soon realized that Phil's postcards, this one is for Raphael Tuck, basically exposed the truth about his life if you know what to look for. Now, Phil's later on in life, there's a memoir by one of his friends that records a conversation where Phil said, "My father was a drunkard and I'm a drunkard too." Now, Phil's father died in 1874 when he was only 10 years old. Phil says he died from a riding accident. The records I found online says he died from bronchitis. So I don't know which is true. Perhaps both are. So this makes it obvious that Phil must have been exposed to alcohol at an early age. And here in this postcard, I think that we may be seeing a romanticized version of how Phil got exposed to alcohol. And you can see here, the soda water bottle and the whiskey bottle here on the table, which later in life was Phil's favorite drink, whiskey and soda. After Phil's father died, the family was plunged into poverty. His mother was a widow and she had 8 children to support. And how in those days did a family survive when this kind of thing happened? Well, the children went off to work and they sent their money home. And that's exactly what happened with Phil. He left home at age 12 and he ended up renting a room with some other boys near the Grand Theater in Leeds. He, at this time, was really enamored with acting and theaters and things like that. He had a number of odd jobs, which he describes as, he was often fired for doing things like spilling paint on architectural drawings. So eventually, through one of his little friends, he got a job mixing paint for this scene painter at the Grand Theater. And the other ways that he made ends meet, and I think probably sent home money to his mother, in Wortley, was that he sketched actors' portraits and sold them. Then he also, for the Grand Theater, designed playbills. And if you see this one here up at the top, this playbill says Grand Theater Leeds, and it's actually dated on a database where I pulled it from. It's dated 1882. So he could have designed this. This could be his work, but I'm not entirely sure. In 1878, at age 15, he had his first sketch published in a little local magazine. And the following year, 1879 to 1880, when he was 16, 17 years old, he got a job creating illustrations for a book. It was a history book, and he was like drawing costumes and things like that. However, by his own account, he would get bored or distracted, and he would go off and drink and then, forget about his work. And the result of that, of course, was that he was fired, and the author of the book found another illustrator to take his place. So this is the first instance that we have where alcohol is a factor in interfering in his work, and he's only a teenager. In the 1881 census, he's living with his mother in Leeds. And that same year, he joined a traveling actors troupe. He was playing bit parts, and they traveled around northern England. And when the weather started getting cold in 1882, late in 1882, they returned to Leeds. And at that time, he was made the costume designer for the Grand Theater in Leeds. And this is where his life kind of gets turned upside down. And who is it that turns his life upside down? A young woman. Now, Phil met a young lady named Mrs. Sarah Elizabeth Emerson Farrar, who was known as Lillian or Lil. She was the manager of her husband John's restaurant and sweet shop, which was located across the street from the Grand Theater in Leeds. And they were married in 1880, and on their marriage certificate, which I found online, he was a rag dealer and she was a candy maker, a confectioner. And you see her here. There are very few pictures of her. Here is a self-portrait of Phil from about the time when he met Lillian. Now, Phil became a regular lunch customer at the Farrar's restaurant, and the three, Mr. and Mrs. Farrar and Phil, eventually became friends, and Phil became a dinner guest. He was often over at their house, and Phil and Lillian, they fell in love and they began an affair when he was 18 and she was about 24. And he had very little money at this time, and he was concerned about, okay, now how do I treat Lillian well? I don't have any money to take her out, illicitly and, wine and dine her. So what was he to do? He decided to go off to London to find an acting job. And this is in late December of 1882. He goes into London from Leeds, and he ends up here you see this is a Raphael Tuck postcard at the Gaiety Theatre in London, and he doesn't have a heck of a lot of money in his pocket. He spends the last of his money in the bar here at the Gaiety Theatre, and most likely, since he was in a bar, he was not only eating, but he was also drinking. So this is another instance of poor judgment on his part. Now, granted, he's young, but he's left with no money to pay for a room for the night. So what does he do? Where can he go? He remembers that he has a relative in London. He goes to his aunt, Mrs. Fred Morton, to her house for help. And Mrs. Morton was Phil's mother's sister. Her husband, Fred, was an actor. They took him in overnight. They fed him, supper and breakfast. But instead of, helping Phil get settled and find a job and whatnot, they kicked him out of the house, and they bought him a train ticket back to Leeds, so he would go home to his mother, which was not at all what he expected. So the sources, his biographers, explain this by saying that Fred Morton was jealous of competition from, Phil was this young, aspiring, wannabe actor. And that seemed like, I don't know about you all, but that sounds like a pretty weak reason to kick out a poor, 18-year-old kid out of the house. So it just didn't sit right with me. So at this point, I'm just trying to think, what's going on here? What Phil does is he gets on the train with a ticket that his aunt provides for him, but he gets off at the very first stop. And he walks back to London and he tries to find a job. He's unsuccessful getting acting jobs, so he ends up homeless. He sells art sketches of celebrities and actors on the streets. He begs, he sleeps under carts in Covent Garden. And here you see one of Phil's later sketches, which is very obviously drawn from his own experience from when he was homeless. The artist is, begging here with his hat, and you can see in the background his artwork propped up against the wall. And I'm starting to wonder here, why did he choose homelessness over going home? There's something definitely very wrong. Eventually, he did go home nearly a year after he ended up in the Morton's house. He went home to his mother only because he got ill from malnutrition. Looking through his postcards, I found what is a clue to what may have happened, what might be another, probably more rational explanation for why he was kicked out. And here you see one of Phil's, another Raphael Tuck right-away card. If you are not engaged, well, you shouldn't be kissing, is what I get from this card. And again, art seems to be imitating life. And I believe that Phil's affair could have been, perhaps it was discovered in Leeds. Did Phil's mother find out? Did she see Phil and Lillian kissing and then tell her sister, Mrs. Fred Morton? And then, Mrs. Morton kicked Phil out because of that. Phil's family was Catholic and Lillian was a Protestant. So she was not only married, she was a Protestant. And you see in the background here, this lady dressed in black with a hat very similar to what Phil's mother wore in that photograph. And also, I wondered about the couple here. The couple, I found photographs of Phil, and he's wearing very similar costume. This is what's called a costermonger's outfit with a mother of pearl buttons down the sides of the bell-bottom trousers and pearl buttons up here. And there are pictures of Lillian wearing a costume very similar to this, with a tight blazer and a skirt and a hat with a big flower on it. And this man, looks a lot like Phil, and Phil was known for inserting himself in his artwork. So this was quite common. So I don't have any actual proof that this is what happened, but it's a possibility. It's another explanation, let's put it that way. So the next thing we find is that in 1883, Phil's big break as an artist comes along. A man named William Allison, who was the editor and founder of a magazine called St. Stephen's Review, comes across this print that you see here on the right that was by Phil, of three drunken actors coming out of a restaurant. And a month or two later, after he saw this print of Phil's work, he had trouble with his staff artist, who submitted unsuitable work for the Christmas issue of 1883. So William Allison was left, scrambling. I need to find an artist to replace this staff artist. So he remembered this print by Phil, and he somehow sent somebody out to find Phil in Leeds, offered him, the commission, and Phil came to London, rented a room, and then in William Allison's memoirs, he describes how Phil, over a period of only 48 hours, produced 4 full-page sketches and a half-page drawing for the Christmas issue, and basically saved the magazine. So a month later, January 1884, William Allison hires Phil May as their staff artist, and Phil moves to London. But he leaves Lillian behind, and they are separated for a bit. So what happens next? Well, the plot thickens. In February of 1884, Lillian Farrar, and you see her here on the right in later, this is a photo from later in life. She disappears from Leeds. She abandons her husband and their one-year-old daughter and moves in with Phil in his flat in London. And obviously, in that time period, the Victorian era, this is just not socially acceptable. So they need to hide their secret, and they concoct a story that Lillian was previously married to a man named Charles Farrar, hinting that he died and she was widowed, but they never actually say that. And that Phil and Lillian were married in April of 1883 when Phil was 19. And he repeats this story in many interviews. And Phil May was so popular and so beloved in London that he was widely interviewed in all sorts of newspapers and magazines and whatnot. And his modern biographers unwittingly perpetuated this false story that they were married when he was 19. And that was something that I discovered, digging around on ancestry.com, that in fact was not true. So they have to figure out, what is the best thing for us to do to avoid scandal. They're very concerned about that. And in 1885, Phil was now starting, he was still poor, but the future looked bright because he now had a position as a staff artist. 1885, that same year, he gets a job offer from the editor of this newspaper in Australia, and you see the header here, the Sydney Bulletin. Phil very boldly negotiates a salary of £30 a week with the editor of this newspaper, which would make him the highest paid staff artist at the time in Australia. He signs a contract for 2 years that could be extended 3. And I, started to wonder, why does he accept a job abroad when things were starting to go well at home? It wasn't easy back then, to move from England to Australia. William Allison, in his memoirs, kind of vaguely hints at things that were going on and says that Phil had other reasons besides pecuniary ones to move. In other words, money wasn't the only reason why he accepted a job. And we know from William Allison's memoirs, he mentions visiting Phil and Lillian at the flat in London. So he must have known that they were living together. So his friends also kind of cover for him as well, and they say he's moving to address his drinking problem, which doesn't make any sense because it was just as easy to get alcohol in Australia as it was to get in England. And then there's another story, they're moving to Australia for Phil's health, which in part was true because he had apparently been diagnosed with tuberculosis. But moving for your health was also at the time a euphemism for, alcohol is one of the reasons why we're getting out of town. Alcohol is a problem. The next we find is that in the fall of that year, John Farrar learns where Lillian is from the nosy neighbor Eva Baxter, who lived near Phil's mother. Mrs. Baxter went to visit Phil at his London apartment to get some money that was owed her, and she is shocked when she finds that Lillian is living with Phil. Lillian was there when she arrived. She goes back to Leeds and she apparently tells John Farrar, Lillian's husband, where Lillian is. So John, of course, hightails it off to London to confront Lillian, and he tries to reconcile with her, and that fails. So he goes back to London alone without his wife. And after that, a few weeks later, in the newspaper, I found an account that said that Lillian wrote Mrs. Baxter a letter asking her, she said, that Phil and I are living together. Please keep it dark. In other words, keep it a secret. Now, also, a few weeks, John Farrar again learns from nosy neighbor Eva Baxter that Phil and Lillian are planning a trip to Sydney, Australia. So he hightails it off to the lawyer and files for divorce on November 10th, 1885. And you can see here on the right is an article that appeared in a small town newspaper in England about the divorce petition. And he charges Lillian with adultery and names Phil as a co-respondent. He asks the jury for an enormous amount of money, £1,000. The jury awards him £750, which is the equivalent of roughly £114,000. Now, how on the earth is Phil May going to pay that amount of money on such a small, relatively small salary? So this immediately puts Phil into debt. So, going to Australia and getting this new job that pays better, twice or three times as much as his job for the St. Stephen's Review, that was a godsend. And it also helped them to avoid scandal. So off they go to Australia. November 11th, 1885, Phil and Lillian leave on a steamship like the one you see here in this postcard. One day after the divorce papers were filed. So they're obviously not wanting to stick around for this erupting scandal. But I never found, one interesting thing, I never found any newspaper accounts in London of the divorce. Only in smaller town papers around Leeds did I find anything mentioned. So William Allison may have hushed the divorce up, because he published a magazine. He knew a lot of the newspaper editors. He may have had it hushed up in London, but I don't have any proof of that. Now, when Phil and Lillian were traveling on the steamship to Australia, they traveled in the passenger lists. They're listed as Mr. and Mrs. Phil May, although Lillian is still married. So they're still pushing the narrative that they're married when they really weren't. They arrive in Melbourne. They live there for a few months. And then in February 1886, they moved to Sydney. And I found newspaper articles there which refer to Lillian. They describe her. She's very beautiful. She's blonde. She dresses stylishly. And her name is Mrs. Phil May. Now, later that year in October, Lillian's divorce was finalized. The following year, in 1887, Phil and Lillian marry in the Anglican Church in Sydney. And I found that marriage certificate online, and that's what, proved to me Phil did not marry her when he was 19 years old. There's no marriage certificate anywhere in England. Unfortunately, even though Phil loved children, they never had any kids themselves. And I think probably the reason for that is because of his alcoholism. Typically, alcoholism, one of the ways it affects men is it makes them impotent in the later stages. The Sydney Bulletin, while Phil was working there, he cranked out an astonishing 900 pen and ink sketches in 3 years. And that sounds like he felt pressure to pay off that 750 pound payment settlement for the divorce. Phil becomes wildly popular with the public in Australia, and he makes his name there. In 1888 to 91, Phil and his wife, now Lillian, travel in Europe. He sketches the locals and sends work back to England for publication. In 1888, Phil writes a friend talking about how he's deeply in debt, and he describes his illusions of painting this grand, enormous historical oil painting, which is delusional, because his pen and ink sketches were done quickly, fast, and you could turn them over very quickly for cash, which is ideal for somebody who's struggling with alcoholism and has trouble focusing and concentrating because of cravings for alcohol. A huge oil painting is not at all practical for someone who has dealing with alcohol and not being able to focus, because it takes a long time to complete an oil painting and they take a long time to dry. You can't sell them immediately like you can a pen and ink sketch. That is something that never materialized. He talked about it and boasted about it, but he never did any big oil painting. In January 1889, one of Phil's biographers found that he returned to England on a commission to sketch the goings on at a big society ball. And at the same time, the biographer states that Phil went to visit his mother. And you remember what happened. Oh, he hadn't seen his mother since 1882. And you remember what happened in 1882. He started his affair with Lillian and he was kicked out of the Morton's house. So apparently, this also is a clue that he was estranged from his mother. He hadn't seen her in 7 years, but they reconciled because later his mother authenticated some of his artwork and put her signature on it, saying that she was Phil May's mother and this was an authentic work, yada, yada, yada. So they did reconcile at some point. Now, in the 1890s, Phil was at the top of his game, the height of his career, but as his fame, he was one of the highest paid illustrators in England during the 1890s. As his fame and his earnings escalated, his drinking escalated as well. In August of 1890, his first illustrated book, they printed 10,000 copies and they sold out immediately. He and his wife moved back from their, traveling around in Europe, from France and Italy and whatnot. They moved back to England permanently, and in 1892 they used the proceeds from his first book to buy a nice house in a posh area of London. He was made a member of the London Sketch Club, and there were lots of postcard artists that were members of that particular club. That same year, he published his first illustrated annual, and 53,000 copies sold out very, very quickly. So he was very popular. He had his portrait that you see here published in Vanity Fair magazine, and that in those days was the mark of you had attained fame. You had attained the height of celebrity if your portrait appeared in Vanity Fair. So he's made it. The following year, 1896, he was made staff artist for Punch, which was England's leading satirical humor magazine. And that same year, another magazine, The Graphic, sent him off on a world tour with a journalist. And they went to New York, they went to Chicago, and then they started having problems. Phil was drinking and partying, and his journalist buddy was doing exactly the same thing. And they did so much partying that they forgot to submit their assignments to, by, I guess, telegraph or something, to England. And the editor recalled them to England and canceled their world tour. So by this time, his drinking it's really interfering with his work. Phil, although he was one of England's highest paid illustrators, he never forgot being homeless. He always had a soft place in his heart for homeless people, for beggars, for people who were struggling, and he had a lot of difficulty saying no to them. So he was known for his reckless generosity. His work depicts poor people, often in contrast to wealthy folks, as you see here. She notices that this rich girl doesn't have any shoes on, and the little rich girl doesn't have any shoes on because she just wants to go and play in the sand. The little rich girl, she's totally oblivious to the plight of the poor little raggedy girl and her mother, and she's got her back turned. So this is an example of a lot of Phil May's work carries these double messages. On the surface, it's presented as a comic card, but when you look at it deeper, it's actually saying that he's suggesting that poor people have more compassion than rich people do. So he's his work is exposing social injustice, but at the same time, it has this veil of humor. And as a result, more wealthy people labeled his art as vulgar, and they didn't like it. However, the publishers, his fellow artists, they called him an erratic genius because he was so talented with no training. Now, here you see a view, romanticized again, of Phil's studio door. His studio was a hub of activity. He had here what you see, a nice dressed lady, a parson, a police officer, a military guy, and the guy on the right is a farm laborer. And they're waiting and hoping that he'll use them as models. But in reality, most of his models were down and out folks. They were beggars, they were out of work actors, jockeys, drunkards. And they hung out in his studio, and he had a whole barrel of whiskey in his studio, which gives you an idea of how severe his alcoholism was at this time. They drank whiskey out of his big barrel in his studio. They, passed the time of day with him. He was very friendly and very kind. They stole his sketches and pawned them at the pawn shop. So his wife is always portrayed as being very tolerant of what was going on. And in 1900, Phil was doing so well that he was working under contract for only two magazines, Punch and the London Graphic. And in 1902, his first Raphael Tuck postcards appear, and they continue to appear till I think 1904. So some of them were published posthumously. So they took his black and white sketches and they colorized them. So this was an additional source of income for the Mays, but it, didn't keep the wolf from the door. Now here's another Raphael Tuck card called The View from the Bed. And again, art is imitating life. The caption says, "I don't know what makes you so thirsty this morning. I'm sure you had plenty to drink last night." And this really sounds like his wife. She was very, she could have a sharp tongue on her occasionally. And I think this was drawn from Lillian's reaction after one of Phil's nightly pub crawls. He usually came home at like 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. And what you see here is a man with a top hat on the chair, and he's drinking out of the pitcher that you usually use to wash your hands and face, which is socially, at that period of time, this is inappropriate behavior. And to me, what this is showing lapses in judgment that people who have problems with alcoholism, they will do commonly socially inappropriate things like this without a second thought. Now, their friends' memoirs and in newspapers, there are countless, hundreds of funny anecdotes of his drunken revels, which are presented as, oh, these are funny, he's humorous, he's kind, he's always presented in a good light, sometimes as a clown. The most famous story of all is when he, during one of his late night drunken revels, all of a sudden he remembers late in the morning that he forgot to get fish from the fishmonger for his wife. So off he goes at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning to the local fishmonger where he lived from wherever he was carousing, bangs on the door, and the fishmonger knows him. So the fishmonger comes down, lets Phil in, and says, Phil says, "Do you have any fish?" And he says, "No, they're all sold out, but I do have this lovely eel for you." And he brings out this humongous 5-foot eel, and Phil says, "Oh, I'll take it." So he buys this enormous eel, wraps it up, takes it home to his wife, dumps it, I guess, on the table or the ice box or whatever. And in the morning, his wife finds it. And what is it wrapped in? He wrapped that eel in sketches that he was supposed to take to an editor. So that's the perfect example of how far he's gone. His perceptions are not always accurate. Now here's another card with another double layer to it. It can be interpreted in two ways: as a commentary on his own life and as a commentary on the early stages of the women's movement, where women start to take on men's roles. As you see here, the woman is leading her family as if she's in the husband's position, and her husband is taking her role with their sons. He's holding the son's hand. His wife at this time, his drinking was escalating to such a point that she had to take over the finances as best she could. And one of Phil's friends wrote in his memoirs that this made him feel henpecked and as if he was second in command, which is exactly what is written on this sandwich board that this guy has up. He's advertising a play called The Second in Command. So this is another example of, he was very clever in his own way of doing these sketches that were social commentary. They were also funny, and they had many different layers, which makes his work really interesting. And then here's another view again. I'm reminded art imitates life, life imitates art, except this time we have proof. You know, before you've heard me say, well, I'm not sure if this is true, but it's possible. Here we have proof of this. Now, this is a Raphael Tuck postcard with Phil May's work on it. It's from the Celebrated Posters series, and it's an advertisement for Apollinaris water, which ironically started out as a teetotaler's drink. Whiskey and Polly, we have many references in biographies and interviews that towards the end of his life, whiskey and Polly was his favorite drink. And I found in one of his friend's memoirs that his friend records having gone into a restaurant and met up with Phil, and he saw Phil at the bar with a whiskey and Polly, Apollinaris water, in both hands. So you had two drinks, one in both hands. And what that says to me is, oh, and he was also talking to an imaginary friend. So at this time, he's hallucinating, which is common during the advanced stages of alcoholism. So it's, what this says to me is that his alcoholism is so advanced that instead of waiting for the waiter to bring him a second drink, he orders two at the same time because he's afraid that withdrawal symptoms will set in, which can be pretty severe, tremors, hallucinations, that sort of thing, and they can be quite scary. And by this time, 1900, 1902, Phil's friends record him as drinking 2 bottles of whiskey a day. And one friend records them making a club to pub crawl over a 24-hour period. They started out at about 10 o'clock in the morning, and Phil goes off and he, with his friend, and he visits places that he knows people, and he meets them there and drinks with them. So they start out in the morning. They visited 12 different clubs. They ate lunch at Romano's, which is a very famous restaurant in London, and they ate lunch with Romano himself. Then they visited 3 press clubs, the Queen's Hotel. They went on in the afternoon to 3 bars. They ate dinner at the Trocadero, another very, very famous, expensive restaurant in London. And then they spent the evening going back and forth to 3 different theaters. Now, they end up at a bar drinking champagne and caviar, and along comes Lillian. She's tracking her husband down. Lillian comes in the bar and ends their drinking spree and demands that Phil come home. And throughout the last couple years of his life, Lillian and 4 of his friends banded together to make sure that he got home safely when he was extremely drunk. Now, at the time when this postcard was made, now here, this is one where we know that the sketch was for this postcard was made in 1902, because here it says in the corner, the new Licensing Act. The new Licensing Act was enacted in 1902, And what it covered was that the new licensing act made it possible for people who were found incapacitated and drunk, in other words, passed out in public, could be arrested and put in jail. And that's exactly what you see here in this right-of-way card. Run in anytime you like. Well, the policemen are running this drunk guy into jail because he was found in public incapacitated. So this postcard is not only, again, on its surface, it's humor, but it also, I believe, expresses Phil's fear of being arrested, being jailed for being drunk in public, and perhaps having a scandal erupt. Because at this time he could not control his drinking, and unfortunately, in 1900, 1902, there were no programs like there are now. Nobody knew what to do with people who had trouble with alcoholism and struggled. And he was very clever at evading his friends' attempts to, limit his drinking. So finally, unfortunately, Phil lost his battle with alcoholism, and he died in 1903 at home of tuberculosis and liver cirrhosis. He was buried in the Kensal Green Cemetery, which is a large, very historic cemetery in London. And here you see, sadly, his gravestone, and it's all unkempt. It has not been kept up. His funeral and his burial service were attended by people from all walks of life, wealthy people, very rich industrialists, people that own newspapers, publishers, editors, and then also the poor people that he helped, that he gave money to. He could not go and walk to an editor's office to turn in his work and return home without giving money to beggars, crossing sweepers. And this is one of the reasons why he had trouble with money all of his life, because he was so generous and kind-hearted. Now, what's remarkable about Phil's life is that, unlike most alcoholics, he kept most of his friends until death. And alcoholism, it destroys people's relationships. It destroys their individuality, and usually people end up alone on the street and estranged from their families. But Phil was a little bit different. Some of his friends, they would say, okay, well, we're not going to party with you, but we'll eat lunch with you. So they set boundaries, but they kept being friends with him, that's very, very unusual. His friends only had good things to say about him throughout his entire life and even after his death. And I only found one instance of an account in an Australian newspaper about a friend who knew him in Australia, who described Phil as having these tremendously variant mood changes, from bad temper to depression, and they described him as being like a mad bulldog. And that is the only account that I've ever seen of that was negative. And it probably does bear a more than a grain of truth about it, because Phil was so famous and so loved by so many people because he was so kind, that the myths and grew up around him, and all these stories and whatnot. So in his own self-portraits, Phil depicts himself as a lovable clown, a buffoon, but his postcards have shown us that he was also a very deep thinker, who cared very deeply about people who were suffering. What's remarkable about his work is that it not only makes us laugh, it also makes us think. It makes us think about social injustice and so many other issues that are still important today. So his work is very relevant even today. At any rate, I hope that was a good summary for his life, and I hope you enjoyed it. Does anybody have any questions?
I have a question. How did you find out all this information? You have a lot of details about his life and what happened, and how did you find all this?
I did what I usually do. I looked on, there's 3 or 4 places that I usually go. The Internet Archive for newspapers, books, and that sort of thing during his lifetime. Newspapers.com, again, for newspaper accounts and interviews during his lifetime. Ancestry.com is where I found some of the divorce papers were in there. And there's, because he was so famous, there's, there were lots of magazine articles about him, and his life was so interesting, and he did so many crazy things that his friends, he had such a wide circle of friends. When they wrote their memoirs, they would write their recollections of Phil, and oh, here's this crazy time when I went out drinking with Phil, that sort of thing. So there are lots of different sources about him, but it took a lot of digging to reveal the business about, he was not really married at age 19 the way he and Lillian, put out there. I found the Lillian's marriage certificate on ancestry.com, and then the information about the divorce. And the way that I found a lot of it was I looked under her name as well as his, and because it was her divorce, not his divorce. So it took quite a lot of digging, but there is a lot of information out there about him. And I think he was one of the first artists, because he was so popular, to really be interviewed on a very large scale.
Is there a collection of his work? Has a collection been published?
Not a catalog raisonné. Yeah, there's 3 main biographies that have been written by him, none of which, and the most recent is by a man named Couple Ditch. And that was published, I think, in the 1970s. Is that right? And even that latest biography repeats this information of they were married when he was 19 years old. But the first biographies and the first works appeared like the year of his death, memoirs and whatnot. And Punch magazine published a lot of collections of his work. But there is no one catalog raisonné. The Leeds Museum and I think the Leeds Library have collections of his work, but there's no like central repository kind of thing.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And it was very interesting. Thank you for all the digging you did and the research you did to tell us his story. I know I could look myself, but I'm just curious if you know what his cards are valued. Are they particularly collected or valuable these days?
No, unfortunately,
not.
Artist signed cards are not really popular these days. Everybody's looking for RPPCs, and the artist signed cards. The ones that I've bought, cards that Phil May did, I've bought his Raphael Tuck cards. They're $8 or $10, something like that. If they're a little crumpled, 3 or 4. And I've found one in the dollar bin. But they're not easily found in the United States, at least it's not here in California.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
So they're not expensive at all that I can see.
Well, that makes them an approachable collection, I guess, then.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
Any other questions? If not, well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ann.
Thank you so
very
much.
Okay. I hope you liked it and found it interesting.
It was
It's very-
fascinating.
Absolutely.
Really
Was
fascinating.
it? Okay, good.
He's a really very kind of a Charles Dickens type character.
Yes, very much so. Very much
mean,
so. Exactly
Someone
right.
out of Hard Times or Bleak House.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much.